we're not going to get the fullest picture of Alaska that we can. We are going to see less and less focus on our rural communities, and not even just like the struggles, but like the joys of those communities. And I don't say this to disparage Channel 2, but if you read a story about Kotzebue in Channel 2, or most rural villages in general, it's about like a murder, right? But if the only news that you're telling about a community are stories about people dying, that has an impact on how audiences view that community. It's why diversity in journalism matters so much. And these great stories that come out of our rural communities, just people living their lives and sharing joy, like you're just missing a perspective. And when that perspective's gone, it's hard to make it up.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is Alaska Public Media reporter Wesley Early. Wesley moved to Anchorage in 2008 and began attending Bartlett High School. He stayed in Anchorage for college, earning a degree in journalism and public communications at the University of Alaska Anchorage. He started working in public radio his senior year of college and has never left. In 2019, he became the news director at KOTZ, the public radio station in Kotzebue, and spent 2 years covering Arctic climate change, subsistence, Iñupiaq culture, and the region's response to COVID-19. Since returning to Anchorage, he's covered city government. But as you heard in the opener, Wesley has a lot to say about the federal funding cuts to public radio and the irreplaceable losses that rural Alaska in particular is imminently facing. Wesley Early, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.
I know that you graduated from Bartlett High School.
I did.
But tell us about prior to Bartlett. Where did you grow up before that?
I was born overseas. My dad, up until recently, worked for the federal government. He just retired at the end of July. He was in the Air Force for, I think, 6 years, and then he moved over to the Department of Defense. He's been a civilian. He's a defense linguist and an analyst, and he just retired. But I was born in England, a town called Harrogate, and then I lived in Germany and Australia as like a toddler. And then when I was 4, we moved to the States. I moved to Maryland. I was there for 3 years. And then when I was 7, we moved to San Antonio, Texas, where I was for 6 years. And then I've lived in Alaska since I was 13. I moved up here in the summer of 2008, right before my freshman year of high school.
And you're turning 31 this year?
I turned 31 in like a couple weeks,
okay.
in September 2nd.
Happy early birthday.
Thank you.
You graduated from high school here and have stayed here. So what about Alaska kept you here or has kept you here so far?
My parents living here necessitated me graduating from high school here. And then I graduated from UAA. I had the Alaska Performance Scholarship and a UA scholarship. And then my mom actually worked for the university at the College of Business. She was an admin. And so I got a tuition waiver. And so I actually got paid like $2,500 a semester to go to UAA. Everything got covered. I was in-state tuition. It's super cheap as far as college.
So they're going to pay you to go to college. You're going to go to college here.
And initially I thought maybe I'll just take my like beginner classes, my general requirement classes, and then go somewhere else, because I don't know that Alaska was really on the list, and I actually didn't really know what I wanted. I was a good student, but I didn't really have a good sense of what I wanted to do. And so journalism was the marrying of a lot of my interests. I was really interested in English and reading. I was really interested in history classes. I had a great history teacher at Bartlett named Mr. Hood, and my English teacher, Ms. Vano. And then I was a total music nerd. I was like an amateur pop music historian that I just really got into as a teenager. And the movie Almost Famous was really important to me when I was a teenager. And so I thought I could be like a music journalist, interviewing bands.
I have to just interject really quick that I sometimes crowdsource questions like, hey, I'm going to interview this person. What should I ask? And I will say that a fellow legislator was like, ask if he's doing those music segues between stories on Alaska News Nightly, because they are very impressed with some of the music choices.
That's funny because I used to produce the nightly news. And so a lot of those music buttons and beds, if they were put in between 2016 and 2019, there's a 50% chance I put it in there. And the music beds, I often, when I'm hosting the nightly news, which I'm kind of our fill-in for Casey Grove whenever he's on PTO, I tend to pick the closing bed and then the buttons that go in between. So I do pick that. We run a balance sometimes of just music. I normally tell the audio engineer, like, my one rule is every closing bet has to be amazing when I'm hosting. Like, it's got to be a banger. And so that's what I do. If I'm hosting, I picked probably every bit of music that was playing.
Okay, so bouncing back, your dad, Air Force for 6 years, DOD, civilian, linguist. What languages?
Russian. He speaks Russian, and he actually speaks several languages pretty well. He lived in Japan for a while, and he speaks pretty good Japanese. He speaks a passable amount of French and Spanish, the sort of languages you would have learned in school in the 70s and 80s. Yeah, and then my mom also speaks Russian, and she actually speaks Russian, French, and English because she grew up in Montreal.
Did you grow up speaking up any other languages?
No, I was just having a conversation with him about this like a month ago, where my dad was very, like, his approach to parenting and interest was like dumping out a box of toys and telling me what each toy was, but he wasn't like forcing me to play with it. He tried to teach me Russian, and I can, like, if I read a word phonetically, like, I can pronounce it. I know maybe a dozen words comfortably. And then I actually took Mandarin in high school. I was part of the first group to actually learn it at Bartlett. It was the first year that I started at Bartlett was the first year that it was being offered. So that's what I took in high school. But I didn't really grow up speaking Russian. I understand a bit from context. My parents would speak Russian to each other. And
Your parents spoke Russian to each other to practice their own Russian, or?
My dad spoke Russian all the time for his job. My mom grew up speaking Russian because her parents were immigrants to Canada.
From Russia?
So my Zieda, my mom's dad is from Russia, or was from Russia. And then my mom's mom, if I understand right, she was originally from Ukraine, but she grew up in like a Belgian orphanage, and she had a really rough upbringing before she moved to Canada. And then they met through the church, the Russian Orthodox Church in Montreal.
Your parents met?
No, my mom's
your mom's parents,
yeah.
Her maternal grandparents. Sorry. How did your parents meet?
So my dad, when he was in the Air Force, his roommate was my mom's cousin, George. My mom's aunt's kids, they all lived in the Maryland area, and they actually all worked for the government. And so my dad knew a lot of them, and he was good friends with George, and he was best man at George's wedding, and he met my mom. And at the time, my dad was dating somebody. So like they met, and then a year later, my dad got invited to my mom's other cousin's wedding because they all knew each other. And he was single then, she was single then, and they started seeing each other. This would have been the early 90s. My mom's parents were not super keen on her dating a Black person. And I don't think it was like overt racism. I think it was very like ignorance in the most general use of the term. They were thinking like, what would people at church think?
Have you been to Eastern Europe?
No, never. No.
I was like, there aren't a lot of Black people there.
I think that like they were just, and when I say ignorant, I think that often carries like a really negative term, but like ignorant in its purest sense is like just not knowing. You're not knowledgeable of this. And I think that they just were operating out of this uncomfortable new, and it was uncomfortable because it was new, because my sister and I were the only grandkids that my mom's parents ever had. My mom has two brothers, but they never had kids. And so like if they were like very prejudiced, they never showed that to me or my sister. So maybe they got over it. I don't know what happened with them, and that all of that stuff happened before I was born and like shortly after. But I know there was a period of time where my mom wasn't talking to her parents. My dad, kind of being the class act that he is, when I was born, he literally called her parents and was like, hey, I know that like things aren't great with us, but I just wanted to let you know that like your grandparents now. And that was, to hear my mom tell the story, like that is when everyone started being cool again. And then by the time my sister was born, like she was like the angel in my dad's eyes. So I think it was just like they didn't know, they had maybe some prejudices that they didn't fully like rationalize or think about. And then they were just those small, tight-knit community. When you're a small immigrant community in a sort of big metropolitan city, you're very tight-knit, and you don't want to rock the boat in your church. You don't want anyone who's ever been to a church with more than 4 people knows that people in church talk to each other. It's not always about praising. And
were you raised Russian Orthodox?
My mom took me to Russian Orthodox Church. I don't know that I was ever a believer. I don't know that I ever believed in God. I've actively believed that God wasn't real since I was like 9, but I used to serve in the altar in a Russian Orthodox church whenever we'd visit. And I think my mom saw it as, oh, Wesley's like participating in the church. And honestly, it was because I could either sit in the back with my mom and her brothers in the choir where I'm just sitting bored, or I could be doing something. I don't know if you've ever been to an Orthodox church. It's very ceremonial. There's the icons, there's the candles, and all of that is brought out by altar boys, similar to a Catholic church. But my dad's an atheist as well. And so I already had that inkling growing up of there's another perspective to this. And yeah, and my dad, for him, he wasn't like mad that my mom took me to church. He was like, to him, that was a cultural thing of like my mom. So it was something where she was passing on her culture to me, whether or not I believed in God or not. But I haven't been inside a Russian Orthodox church, well, maybe 7 years since my dad passed away. And I used to go pretty semi-regularly. Like whenever I visited Canada, every Sunday I was normally at the...
Is your grandmother still alive?
No, she passed away when I was about 5. She passed away shortly after my sister was born. She had cancer, and then my dad was alive for about another almost 20 years after that. But yeah.
I made an assumption that your parents were practicing their Russian, but really your mother was like a native Russian speaker.
So she lived in Montreal, which is a bilingual community, so everybody speaks French and English, and then she was going to Russian school. I think my dad speaks better Russian than my mom does because he has to for work. Like he has to be up and about it. And I think that my mom, it's like the difference between someone who like grows up speaking English in America and someone who like learns English. And so they are aware of syntax and all of these things. And someone who casually learns the languages, like English. People don't speak proper English all the time.
But you're understood. Because your mother's understood, but it may not be perfect.
I think she's a great Russian speaker. She sounds like someone who's spoken Russian her entire life. I think my dad is just like a technically better Russian speaker, but they both speak Russian fluently.
And I guess I think I know the answer, but do you identify as Russian? Are you like a Russian American?
No, I don't consider myself. I consider myself Black because to like the average person, I am noticeably not white. And so I think I have Russian family members. I am of Russian descent. I identify more as Black just because it's personal and it's practical, frankly. And I don't like the term African American from like a technical standpoint. Like I can't name the last member of my family who was from Africa, right? I think people say African American because it sounds less harsh than Black. Someone says Black, I think to some ears it's like a really harsh term, and African American sounds nicer, but I'm Black. Some people would say I'm mixed. I don't really throw that term around. Do you know who E.J. David is?
Yeah, I've had him on the podcast.
Yeah, he and I were talking a while ago, and he talked about his kids because he's Filipino and his mom's Athabascan. Philibascan.
Yeah, Philibascan.
And he doesn't use the word half because they're not half Filipino and half Athabascan. They are Athabascan and they are Filipino. And that's how I feel. Like I am Russian. I am Black. I typically identify as Black because it's more practical, but I have Russian family. And yeah.
What was your relationship like with your paternal grandparents? I guess your Black grandparents.
Yeah. So my dad's not sure if he's ever met his dad. He thinks maybe when he was a little kid, he met him once or twice, but he wasn't around. And my grandma had my dad when she was 18. And to hear my dad describe it, he's got a lot of complicated feelings toward his mom. And I think that he kind of understands that she was in no position to take care of a kid, let alone 3 other kids. My dad had 3 brothers. 2 of them are still alive. My uncle Stephen died when I was really young. And so in a lot of ways, my dad had to be like the man of the house pretty young. And he had a couple stints in foster care, while my grandma wasn't able to take care of him. So, I mean, my grandma is really nice. I see her whenever I go to DC. I visit her whenever I can. She just texted me the other day. My grandma sends these really long paragraph texts of like, "Hi, Wesley. I hope you and your wife are great. I'm sending you lots of prayers." She sends like emojis in. It's really funny. We have a good relationship. I just saw her last year and I helped her get some medication from the pharmacy. That was the time I had with her. It was like, well, I need to go to the pharmacy. And I was like, well, I'll take you to the pharmacy.
I guess you kind of were in an island almost with your nuclear family.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
There
no.
wasn't a lot of interaction with the grandparents.
So we went to Canada every summer. My mom, my sister, and I. My dad still felt some type of way about my mom's parents, rightfully so. He wasn't like rude to them. But yeah, it was just the four of us. My sister's 5 years younger than me. She just turned 26. She lives in DC. And then when we were in Maryland, we saw our family because my dad's family lived in DC. My mom's cousins all live in Maryland. And so we'd see them occasionally. But really, once we moved to Texas when I was about age 7, 8, it was pretty rare that we saw that side of the family, with the exception of I saw my grandfather and my uncles every year when I would go to Montreal, my mom's two brothers and her dad.
I'm curious, given your history, do you, as a reporter reporting on Russia, really? I mean, we talk about Russia a lot in Alaska.
We were talking about it this
Talking
week.
about it this week in particular. Do you feel like you think about those stories differently because of your family?
It's more, I think, because of my dad's job. Without getting into too many details, there is a reason that my dad works for the Department of Defense and knows Russian, right? He is aware of our country's relationship with Russia in a wide swath of ways. I think I feel the way about Russia the way most Americans do. I'm not particularly attached to that part of my heritage, at least when it comes to my reporting. I bring it up when I interview Russian people. I'm like, oh, and it's there's some overlap there, but it doesn't come up as often as you might think.
And then I think, get back to Alaska and moving to Bartlett. Can you talk a little bit about being a Black teenager in Anchorage?
It was pretty okay.
Well, you have stuff to compare it to, though, because you came from Texas.
Yeah, I lived in San Antonio, and to get a good sense of what it was like the types of kids at my school, there was a whole page in my middle school yearbook of people with the last name Gonzalez. A lot of Hispanic people. My best friend was Mexican, and I picked up a bit of Spanish only because his grandma spoke Spanish almost exclusively. And so if I wanted some of the food she was making, I had to ask in Spanish, and she made really good food. And I don't know. I don't know that I approached like my Blackness in a serious way. I think I got more into like my Blackness as a college student. I grew up in very white spaces, and so I was often one of only a couple Black kids. Bartlett's the second most culturally diverse high school in the country, behind East Anchorage High School, and we had Black kids. And I don't know that I have a good way to answer that question.
And it may not have been a very good question. Something that I was conscious of in doing this Alaska media series is that I'd had all white men until this moment. I definitely have some women who are in the queue to come on, but I became conscious of it. I think on the fifth interview, I was like, oh my God, like, why am I only talking to white men about being a journalist in Alaska?
I don't know the specific numbers, but I would venture a guess that at least 90% of the journalists in the state are white. If you're throwing a dartboard, like, it's pretty hard to hit me, right? Yeah. There's a lot more of the sort of ethnic swath than me. But I was actually thinking the other day, to get back to your question, I think that I wasn't fully appreciating, I didn't fully recognize the impact that having a Black president had on me as a teenager. Because I moved to Alaska like during the campaign. Barack Obama gets elected middle of my freshman year of high school, and he left office when I had finished like my first full year on the job as a reporter. And so for like arguably the most formative years of my life, the most powerful person in the world was not just a Black man, but like a mixed Black man. And I don't know that I was super cognizant of it at the time, but I think that looking back, it really informed in a lot of ways my approach to, I don't know, there may have been a subconscious self-esteem thing in there. Like even in hindsight, not that I support everything Barack Obama did or think everything he did was awful, but I have a very nuanced view of Obama as an adult, like I think a lot of us do. But just like the simple act of him being Black, like my dad cried when he got elected. Up until that point, my dad was a very emotionally closed off person, like a lot of men his age, and not specifically him, but like he got emotional about it. And it was something that like I could tell it was a big deal outside of the politics of it, just that representation part of it. And my dad's a very liberal guy, but he also worked for the government. So he couldn't have campaign signs out in his yard. He took that seriously. He took his oath very seriously, and he did very apolitical work. But like personally, he was a very liberal person. And so I think that in that respect, I think that I grew up at a time that it was a good time to be a Black teenager. It really felt like, the sky was the limit. And I think that really weighed into like my mindset moving forward.
So you brought up politics with your parents. Was your mother political at all?
Yeah. So she's still a resident alien. So she's not actually a citizen. She's still a Canadian citizen, but she has political beliefs. They're pretty similar to my dad's. I think that my mom doesn't vote, but I think her and my dad are pretty left of center.
In the current climate with immigrants, do you worry about your mom? I know she's Canadian, but
I don't worry about it. I don't know if it's going to be an issue. I think that so much of this is uncharted waters in the way that immigration has been approached federally. And it's certainly like a possibility, but I don't know that I've ever really sat down and thought, could my mom get deported? She is as American as anybody else, except for when I think it was 2010 or 2014 Winter Olympics when Canada beat the U.S. in hockey. My mom ran up and down our street with a Canadian flag. She's definitely like a Canadian, but she does things that Americans do.
Did she have feelings? It seems like that rhetoric died down about making Canada the 51st state a few months ago in the Trump administration.
I've never asked my mom about it. I don't know that she would have taken that as a serious thing.
Okay, let's get to your first job as a journalist. You said that you took your first job in Barack Obama's last year as president. So I guess
I started as an intern at Alaska Public Media in January of 2016.
Got it.
And my supervisor when I was an intern was a woman named Monica, who is the web editor at Alaska Public Media, someone who basically handles web content. And I helped her out with that. And then she moved like a month after I started my internship. And so I was doing her job as an intern, just instead of 40 hours a week, I was doing it with 23 hours a week. I was a paid intern, which was nice. And then I was getting ready to graduate college. I didn't really think that Alaska was the place I wanted to be. I wanted to go where the news was. I didn't really see Alaska as being particularly newsy. And they were hiring for a web editor, but even the job that I was doing, like the job description said they wanted somebody with a certain level of experience. And I had no experience in journalism going into my internship as outside of like classwork. I had a job that I was working about 40 hours a week. I worked at the Kohl's over at Kotzebue Commons. I was a customer service supervisor, and I was very good at signing people up for credit cards. Like I would like $1,000 to $2,000 a year. I was like the number one credit card solicitor in the Pacific Northwest for Kohl's for a while. And I think it's why I work in public media now, is like my atonement for all the credit scores that I ruined when I was in high school and college. But so I had a 40-hour a week job, and I was a full-time student. So I didn't have any time to like volunteer at the radio station, volunteer with the paper.
Did you know you wanted to work in radio, or was it you just happened to get that internship?
So going into college, I thought I'd like to be a music journalist. I'd like to see where this goes. Like Rolling Stone was the dream job. And then I started taking radio classes. And around the time that I was taking radio classes, NPR was doing a lot of really great music coverage. I can't remember if the Tiny Desk concert was around then, but like I found that NPR was producing some really cool music stuff. And so I thought, oh, maybe that's an avenue for me. And then I had a great professor at UAA. Her name's Elizabeth Arnold. She actually used to be like an NPR, like Washington, D.C. Hill reporter. Like she used to cover the White House. And so she had this great experience. And so she really got me into radio. And then I almost switched majors pretty early because I had a professor who, I don't know, like with the heavy workload that I had outside of school, it was really hard for me to keep up with this class that was like an entry-level journalism class. It required like a lot of outside work. And I'm like, I can do some of that, but I have a job. And so I ended up dropping that class.
Why did you work 40 hours a week? Because you had all those.
Because I still had a job, and I moved out. Like I got my own apartment in my junior year, so I still had a job. I was working. I wasn't really getting money from my parents. I lived at home for 2 years when I was in college, but like any spending money that I wanted, I needed the job. And this wasn't a particularly high-paying job, and so I had to work to have a certain amount of money. And then when I did end up moving out, I was working and going to school, and my scholarships ran out after 4 years, and so I was dead set on graduating in 4 years, and I did. But anyway, so I dropped that class because I thought it was just too much work for me personally. But the class I had right afterward was taught by Mark Trahant, who up until recently, I don't know if he still is the editor-in-chief of Indian Country Today, but at the time he was basically like one of the foremost Native American journalists in the country, and he was the Atwood chair at UAA, and he got me really excited about journalism. And I stuck with it because of him. I went into radio because of Elizabeth Arnold, but I like stuck in journalism because of Mark Trahant. By like middle of my college experience, I was like, I could be a public radio reporter and just like work in radio. And then I got the internship.
What do you think for you makes radio more attractive than print?
I think that I really like the ability to like be face to face with somebody and talking to them in a way that's very intentional. I feel like audio interviews are a lot less extractive, if that makes sense. I think journalism in itself is inherently extractive. We are basically taking other people's experiences and passing them on to a wider community. But I don't know. I think that there's a small part of it that was like people telling me they liked the sound of my voice. And also I liked audio producing. It was like puzzle making, putting everything together and mixing. And I've applied for jobs to work more print focused like years ago when I was still looking for lower 48 jobs. But I really like public media. Personally, I think all news should be free. I think that it is a public service. I think that it is something that everybody should be able to access. And honestly, if you have a library card, you can access most news for free. The libraries have done a really good job of keeping up with that. But I think that we have people who believe in the idea of news being free. They donate to us, and we provide this service for free. If you can't afford a newspaper subscription or cable service, you can listen to the radio for free. You can go to our website for free, and you can read all of our news for free. And I really believe in that. It's not so much I work at this place that happens to give news away for free. It's that I choose to work here because we give news away for free. That's become a lot more solidified the older I get and the longer I do this.
How do you push back on the narrative that free news in America, public media in America, is liberal indoctrination, that it has this liberal bias, and that's why we have to shut it down, because we're basically indoctrinating people who only listen to the free news into this more liberal way of looking at the world?
I think that's untrue. I think that public media reporters, certainly the ones I work with, especially in Alaska, like Alaska is, depending on who you ask, like it's a red state, right? At least voting wise. I think it's trended more purple over the last decade, but in a lot of ways it is a conservative state. We have conservative lawmakers. We have to cover them. We have to cover them fairly. And I don't think that there is a liberal bent to like the truth. I don't think there's like a liberal bent to going out of our way to present sides more equally. I think that people are accustomed to news outlets that are more political. And so when somebody presents something that doesn't, for lack of a better word, hype up the right, it's anti-right. And I think that's not true. I think that we approach the news in a way that is fair and transparent and accountable, and we try to represent multiple perspectives. We're not unbiased, and no journalist in the world is unbiased. We bring our experiences to the work that we do, and story selection is a big part of what we do, and like the stories we choose to cover are indicative of bias, but we're fair in how we cover them. We are trying to get at the truth of the matter, and knowing full well that our audience is largely, at least you would assume our audience is pretty conservative. You look at towns like Petersburg, very conservative town, they love their public radio station, right? Kodiak, another one, they just raised like 150 to 200, I can't remember, it was either 150, $250,000 in a day. Kodiak's a very Republican town. They love their public radio station. I think that there is pressure to silence sort of anything that doesn't hype up a certain narrative. And we're seeing that with attacks on public media, with attacks on mainstream educational institutions. We're seeing this with attacks on like other mainstream news outlets, like what happened with CBS News. So I think that I don't
I'm
know
going to
that.
talk about CBS News really fast since you mentioned it.
Yeah.
Because Jeff Landfield, I interviewed him for the podcast. It hasn't come out yet, but he says that if you watch the unedited version of the Kamala Harris interview and then the edited version, what he says on the record is, I never would have edited it that way. I do think it was unfair. And I think it did show a bias. In other words, if you just read the news coverage, everyone says that CBS would have won that lawsuit and that them settling the $16 million was them wanting to not create waves with the Trump administration because they were trying to get that deal approved with Skydance to purchase them.
Yeah.
But full confession, I haven't gone back and watched it.
The way that I understand it, and I wasn't super like dialed into that story, but the way that I understand it was CBS promoted that interview using tape that didn't end up making it into the final cut. And that's not something I would have done. It's that to me is less of a intentional, willful, partisan decision and more of an editorial oversight that I think should have been addressed. It's, for lack of a better, it was a boo-boo. When we do our nightly newscasts every night, the nightly news opens up with 2 audio cuts that preview future stories. And the audio cut that you hear will end up showing up later. And I can't think of a time it didn't. I think that is what I assumed happened. That I don't think it was willful. I don't know that I would have made that decision. In fact, I don't think I would have made that decision, but I'm also not CBS News.
Hey, can I ask you a journalistic integrity thing? Again, I'm not a journalist, but I play one on a podcast.
Sure.
So for my teaser, I definitely clip from the interview and put it up front. Something that I feel like will grab listeners' attention. I have before taken a couple of sentences from one part of the interview and a couple of sentences from the other part of the interview and put them together. The whole interview will air, so you'll hear, oh, those 2 sentences actually don't go with those 2 sentences. Is that okay?
I think that gets into sort of the presentation of the news and like what is taking away from like the gist of what the person said. We run into that too, where we, not so much in like the previewing aspect of it, but like in the having to shorten interviews for the air. And the most I can normally get away with for what we call a 2-way interview is like 5.5 minutes. I've interviewed people for like 40 minutes and I had to cut it down to 5.5. And we have different rules for different people. If it's a government official, like an elected official, we don't typically cut them sentences down. We don't even cut like long pauses or things like that. If I'm interviewing like an Olympian or some kid who did something really cool, if we're not taking away from the gist of what they're saying, and that is where kind of an editorial call comes in, like it's normally fine. I think for your purposes, it's fine because you're not, despite your claim early, what you are doing and what journalists do are pretty different in some pretty key ways. But I think if you are not willfully trying to like present something else, that's an editing thing that should be fine.
So I got criticized on social media by someone that he had real problems with James Brooks coming on my podcast and basically did a very negative post saying that for an elected official like me to have an independent journalist on is cringe. That was his word, and a major misstep by James Brooks. And of course, there's part of me that's, did you listen to the interview? Because I think it's quite clear that we're both expressing our sides of the street. And there's no pretending that I'm not an elected official. He's asking me direct questions about why I'm not doing certain things as an elected official. And so to me, I felt this is somebody who hasn't listened to the podcast, who's just making assumptions.
Was this person who critiqued you someone you would describe as left of center?
Will Muldoon in Juneau.
Okay.
I'll just say his name. He criticized me with his name. Would I say he's left of center? Yes, but he also
Sure. Yeah.
plays a contrarian in the social media space.
Yeah. I didn't just say yes to this. I had to clear it with my bosses and make it clear that anything that I say here could in some way reflect on Alaska public, and I can't really express a political belief. I talk to classes and I'm pretty direct. I try not to lie to people, but I tell the truth and I try to express my opinion on the field. I try to express my experience. So yeah, I don't know. And I did listen to James's interview. Before I said yes, I listened to James's to make sure that it would be a place where it was really talking about me in the field, or in his case, him in the field, and his approach to how he does what he does. And I thought he explained it pretty well. There were a couple times where he pushed back on you. You describe, I think you used a blanket term for like the media, and he was like, that's like saying the government, right? So there were opportunities for him to not just let you dog walk him, but also I think that James is a consummate professional, and he handled it.
I will say that I was tired during that interview, and I think that I allowed him to become the interviewer a couple of times. So when I was like editing the interview, I was like, oh my God, like, why is he asking me the questions? Why am I giving these long, rambling responses? The impetus for me doing these interviews was Sean McGuire leading the ADN, Emily Goody-Kunz leaving the ADN, Tom Hewitt leaving the ADN, David Hewlin retiring as the editor. To me, as a politician who, as much as folks say politicians are dependent on the media, like to get our message out, and with the newspaper of record in Alaska having this enormous turnover all in a pretty brief period of time, I felt like I wanted to try to highlight what is the state of media in Alaska. I started this before the rescission of funding for public media. I was appalled that I interviewed Nat Hers right after he had Lisa Murkowski on his podcast, and he did not ask her one question about the rescission. So let's talk about Kotzebue. That will be a good way of highlighting what the rescission means, I think. Yeah, so how did you get to Kotzebue, and what was that experience like?
I had been in Alaska Public Media for about 3 years as the web editor. I started out as the web editor, which is not really what I wanted to be doing. When I graduated college, I wanted to be a reporter, and when I got hired, my boss, Lori Townsend, and another former executive, Pat Yak, they sat me down.
Pat Yak, who's the husband of Suzanne Downing.
Yes. I don't know if they're still married or not, but yes. They kind of asked me what I would think about applying for the job. And I was pretty honest with them, saying, I don't really want to do that job. And they countered with, look, for someone fresh out of college, working for next to the newspaper of record, arguably the most respected news outlet in the state, is a pretty good place to start. We can't guarantee that you'll be out reporting all the time, but you will have chances to do it. And they were able to convince me. And so I was the web editor, and then I became the web editor and the producer of the nightly news about maybe a year in. And then for about a year and a half, I was the education reporter as well, while having those other two duties. And so I was overworked. I had so much, I was churning out maybe 3-4 stories a week on education, while also editing most of our web content and producing the nightly news every day. There was actually a month-long period between morning news hosts where I was hosting the morning news and producing the nightly news for a month. And I just felt overworked. I was applying for these lower 48 reporter jobs because I wanted to be a reporter. And I was getting rejected, and that was not great. I got this feeling of, am I only Alaska good? Am I only good enough to be a reporter here? And so the KOTZ job opened up. KOTZ hadn't had a news department in about a decade. And so they were restarting it, and they wanted to hire a news director. And I was so frustrated. I joke, but I was almost basically so frustrated at not getting these reporter jobs in bigger markets that I was like, fine, I will just move to rural Alaska and build a news department, which is what I did. And so in 2019, I moved to Kotzebue. It would have been September of 2019, about 6 months before all the pandemic shutdowns happened. And that's how I got there.
It seems like a crazy time to be starting up a news department right at the start of COVID.
Yeah, and when people asked me about my time in Kotzebue, it was really hard for me for a while to separate my feelings about the pandemic from my feelings about Kotzebue, because those first 6 months I was in Kotzebue were great. I was playing basketball 3 times a week, open gym. I had a radio club at the Boys and Girls Club, so we were having the kids come in and record spots. They weren't out reporting. These were 7 to 12-year-old kids, but I tried to teach them soft skills, like interviewing. I brought in the police chief one day, and I was like, ask the police chief question. And he knew coming in, I want you to treat this like these are kids asking you questions. You're going to be honest. So I brought in the police chief, and, I felt like I was getting out in the community. People were starting to know who I was. I would call basketball games over the radio. I was starting to become like known. And then the pandemic happened, and it shut everything down. And I went from building my way into this community to going to work, going home, going to the grocery store, going home. That was it. My partner lived in Anchorage, my then girlfriend, now wife. So we were long distance. We actually started dating the summer before I moved, like after I'd already accepted the job. Like we knew I was moving to Kotzebue when we started dating. And I think we both thought it was going to just be like a summer fling. And then moving day came, and I honestly couldn't think of a good reason to break up with her. So I was like, okay, I guess we're going to be long distance. So that was hard. I think there was a period of time where if I would have told my boss, hey, I know I told you that I'd be here for 2 to 3 years, but I didn't think that a global pandemic was going to shut the world down. And I really think for me, like, it would be better for me to be in my comfort zone in Anchorage. I think they would have been disappointed, but they would have understood. But, and this is going to sound a little sanctimonious, but the little voice in my head was, if there was ever a time for a community to have a news department, it might be in the middle of a global pandemic. And so that was the overriding factor that made me stay. But I made it clear to them, this is going to be 2 years, not 2 to 3. So it did change a little bit about how long I planned on being in Kotzebue, and it changed the type of work I was doing and how I did it. But yeah, I think the biggest, this feels weird to say, but like one of the biggest downsides to the pandemic in Kotzebue is I feel like I didn't get the full community experience. And that I really regret. I've had a couple chances to go back since and really love that community. The people in the community are really nice. People who I barely met were super warm. I remember somebody baked me a crumble for my birthday, like after I offhand mentioned that I had a birthday coming up. And this was a woman I interviewed one time. But the community was really warm, and I think that they loved their radio station, and it's such a community lifeline up there. And I wasn't just reporting. I was one of a staff of the full-time staff were like 4. And so there were times where I had to DJ. There were times where I had to do community messages. There were every day, I don't know if they still do it, but they have the request hour. So literally it's an opportunity for people to like call in and say happy birthday, happy anniversary. And just one of the most heartwarming things I would ever hear on the radio. Our normal DJ got tired of it because he did it like every day. You hear all of these every day, you get tired of it. But I would occasionally do it. And my favorite thing was when someone would call in and say, hey, this is so-and-so in Norvik. I just want to wish my brother in Kivalina happy birthday. Many more years to come. Hold on. And they would pass the phone to someone else, and they were like, hey, happy birthday. And then my favorite was when like they would pass it to a kid, maybe 6, 7 years old, and they're like, hi. And you can hear the parents going, happy birthday. Happy birthday. Like it was so like things like that, just like really, it's so heartwarming to see that level of connection across, miles, because Northwest Arctic Borough is huge. It's 10 villages and Kotzebue. But these are so tight-knit. It was so great to see that. And the radio station facilitates a lot of the things that make the Northwest Arctic a really great place. It adds to that.
I will tell you that, and I'm not proud of this, for listeners, I don't normally do this, but I wasn't super prepared for your interview today. So I did ask AI, what are the top 3 most important stories that reporter Wesley Early of Alaska has worked on? And it gave me a lot of info. I don't know if you'd agree with all of it, but it sent me just reams of stuff. But number 1 was like reporting from Kotzebue, talking about subsistence lifestyle, talking about the Alaska Native experience and the Northwest Arctic as being the most important work. AI views that as the most important work you've done.
That's nice. It's nice that AI seems to think I am like very wary of AI. Like, I think that it's not fully, I just don't know that we fully examined the parameters that it'll have. And it's this Wild West. And at this point, like, we've actually had discussions in our newsroom for what are ethical uses of AI in reporting. I use this software called Otter to transcribe interviews. And it's an AI software that does that. That's about it. That is the extent to which I use AI. We've discussed about whether using AI could help people go through court documents, whether AI could help generate headlines. Maybe I'm old school in this, but I think that like this job can and should be done by like thinking people. And so I'm wary of AI, but that is nice to hear.
I'm going to basically second what you just said. One way that I thought that I could use AI, because I work really hard on the interview. I edit it and I try to make it like tight. I try to make it sound good. Mm-hmm. And then it'll usually be like 11:30 p.m. and I want to release the next morning. And I'm like, oh my God, I have to record an intro. And that requires brain energy. It requires me like Googling and like looking at all the different information and saying, what do I want to include? What do I not? And it was like, oh, I'm going to ask AI, write me an intro for Wesley Early. I have him on my podcast. I need 45 seconds. Yeah. And what usually happens is it will produce something that at first glance looks perfect. But then when I actually record it, I realize there's no there. There's no content here. These are a lot of words that sound really good, but they're not actually saying who this person is. And so the one time I did try to do that for a guest, I had to basically just scrap it.
Yeah.
Just like, I'm going to have to do this hard work myself. AI is not going to help me.
I think there's value in doing it yourself. I think that we should know how to read a court document. You shouldn't rely on an AI to read it. There are some interesting applications of AI in like web development, which I think that's a pretty good way of going through it. But do I also think people should know how to code, at least rudimentary levels of it? Yeah, I took a web design class in college. I'm not out building websites, but I can troubleshoot issues sometimes, especially on our old website before we changed over to a new website in the last year. But like when I was web editor, I would troubleshoot some issues. There's value in knowing how it works, even if you don't necessarily know how to do it. And I think that there's value in, I keep reading these stories about how like college students are like overly reliant on like ChatGPT. And to me, that is like, oh man, we're cooked. If so many college students aren't able to actually do the critical thinking that I think is what you go to college for. You don't go to college unless you're like a doctor or in the sciences. You're not going to learn new things often. You're opening up new perspectives and maybe ways you weren't thinking, or in a lot of ways enhancing your critical thinking. And I think that is like really important. But if we're using ChatGPT as just a like this model of doing, I don't know, that doesn't even take into account all of these jobs across the country that could get impacted by AI, people who could be out of a job if we start putting AI into things. I think that we are, to borrow from like Jurassic Park, where Jeff Goldblum's character says, we're so caught up in if we can that we're not caught up in if we should. I think lots of people are going to lose their jobs before we start to think, how can we address the impact that AI is going to have on our workforces? I think that lots of people are going to have to relearn things if they keep relying on AI. And I think that we should be, as much as we can, AI should be like a tool. We see it sometimes with things like Grammarly, but also I'm like, maybe we should learn how to write sentences, right? We shouldn't be reliant on Grammarly. We should be reliant on being able to type things and communicate. Like that is value. And I worry that we're losing that value and ability to communicate.
Can you tell us what the most memorable story for you in Kotzebue was? Do you remember a particular story that you think about today even?
There's a story that I did that really, to me, hit at the value of local journalism. I was doing a story about a water subsidy program in Northwest Alaska, which is about as exciting as it sounds. Because basically the Northwest Arctic Borough had this program where they would work with the villages to help handle their water programs. And as a sort of added benefit,
like their drinking water program?
Their drinking water, all of their water services.
Everything.
Yeah. And as a result of it, it would actually lower water bills, because I don't know if it's with efficiencies or what, but like water bills would get lowered. And I got a tip from one of the people who worked with the borough. The borough was right across the street. So I was often talking with like guys who did like infrastructure projects and things like that. They'd pop by the radio station and I'd chat with them. And he goes, yeah, every village but one is participating in this program. And so I thought, I wonder why that one village, it was the village of Iñupiaq, wasn't participating in this program, which to me as an outside observer seemed like, well, it's like, your water systems run better and your water bills are lowered. That seems to be a
no-brainer.
Right. What are they missing out on? And so I interviewed the people with Iñupiaq, and interesting thing about Iñupiaq is that it's actually I believe it's the only one of those villages in the Nana region that it only has a tribal government. So most of them have a city and tribal government. Iñupiaq was entirely run by the tribe. And they explained that we want to handle things ourselves. We appreciate the help, but we just really would rather do it all ourselves. They had an independent streak among the villages. And so I do this story, and I remember Julie O'Malley at the time was actually my editor on it, because when I lived in Kotzebue, I was like the news director of a department of one, but still most of my stories were edited by somebody else in the radio network. That's another reason why the radio network's so great, is because a lot of these one reporter newsrooms have a swath of professionals they can lean on. And I leaned on Julia to edit my stories. The only stories that I didn't get edited were like, we would do a story every time there was a new COVID case in one of the villages. And I wrote so many of those that I didn't need another set of eyes on it. I just needed to plug in where it happened, how it got spread, and this general sort of boilerplate language about what the local health consortium said. But anyway, so Julia's editing this story. And like halfway through my edit, I remember asking her, like, Julia, is this boring? Is this a boring story? She told me, yes, but it's important. And, you know, a water subsidy program in Iñupiaq, like that's not a story that would run on statewide. Like when I produced the nightly news, I don't know that I would have put that on statewide. I don't know if it did run.
You would have been really desperate for a story that night.
For sure, yeah. But 6 months later, I'm like talking to that guy who worked for the borough. And he goes, hey, by the way, like Iñupiaq signed on to that water subsidy program. Like after you did that story, they started thinking about it. And so a part of me is like, a village in Northwest Alaska is saving a certain amount of money on their water bills because of a story that I did.
I love that story because my husband would just die of embarrassment when I'm like, you're making it about you again. But I interviewed Maya Lukin, who was former mayor of Kotzebue.
Yeah.
And for listeners, she explains a lot about tribal governments and about the corporations and about the city government and who's responsible for what and how complicated that can be. I think a super interesting and, dare I say, important episode from my perspective. But in the grand scheme of all the podcast interviews I've done, a lot of people were not that interested in hearing from the former mayor of Kotzebue.
Yeah, she was like the superintendent for the like parks region, right?
Yeah, for what's that park called?
Not Gates of the Arctic. Was it?
Yes,
Gates of the Arctic?
She did. She was superintendent of the Arctic. She was mayor when Obama came to visit.
Yeah.
Anyway, so yeah, no, I'm really glad you told that story.
Yeah, it was an instance of I contributed to my community in a way that was tangible. Oftentimes we send stories out into the world. We don't know if people are going to be interested in it or not. We see reactions on Facebook, but a reaction doesn't necessarily indicate that someone read it. Neither does a comment. And so I don't know if someone's going to read this story that I did, but to know in some small way, and in the grand scheme,
you changed the course of history of Iñupiaq.
Maybe someone's able to afford a couple extra groceries a month, or I don't know how much the discount is, but something I did made a tangible impact in a community. And it's not the most exciting story, but it was heard by the right people.
So you left Kotzebue and came back to Anchorage.
Yep.
Talk about your experience in Anchorage the last few years, what you've been working on.
So yeah, I moved back in September of 2021, a couple months after Dave Bronson became mayor. And like the very first thing that I was covering was this pretty acrimonious debate over mask mandates, which was weird for me because that level of that combative nature wasn't really new to anybody who'd been in Anchorage for the previous year and a half. But because I'd spent my time in Kotzebue for that really the worst part of the pandemic, I got a different community perspective than what Anchorage seemed to be going through. Like in Kotzebue and the Northwest Arctic, so much of the messaging was like socially distance, stay home if you're feeling sick. We need to protect our kids. We need to protect our elders. Get vaccinated when the vaccines are. I actually got vaccinated a lot earlier than a lot of people in Anchorage did because I lived in Kotzebue. Like I got my first vaccination in February of 2021. I think most people were starting to get them in like maybe May, April. But because I lived in a community where the tribal healthcare system was the main one, I was able to get vaccinated pretty quick and people were getting vaccinated up there. And it was just a totally different energy. there were people who complained about it, but like they weren't out in the streets complaining about it. They were either privately grumbling to themselves, but even they, I think, understood that, yeah, we should keep our elders and our kids in. There was such a focus on that community aspect. When I came back to Anchorage, I was just shocked at how angry people were on both sides of it. One side was certainly angrier, and I think that's fair to say. And so I was covering these very testy meetings, and then I covered the Bronson administration and his relationship with the assembly. So I covered his term, and then I've been covering Mayor LaFrance's term for the last year and a bit.
Can we talk about the rescission of the funding?
If you want to, yeah.
Yeah.
We can talk about it.
I interviewed James Devins, who was the director of the Valdez station.
KCHU, yeah.
Yeah. 70% of their funding was federal funding.
Absolutely.
James talks a lot about the fact that their per capita donor number is quite high, that they're not going to be able to milk their listenership for more donations. Their listenership already donates at an astronomically higher rate than you would get in New York City, for example.
And I think a lot of rural communities are facing that same problem. There is no base of donatable income in those communities. For Alaska Public Media, we lost $1.49 million, which is about 20% of our budget. So it's not nothing. And we are having to make decisions on how to navigate that. It's been hard for me when people ask what I think about it because, like, I want to be honest. And I want to say it's bad for us and it's worse for rural stations, right? And I don't want that to sound like we're fine because it's not nothing for us. We are worried about how this could impact our delivery of services and the sort of domino effects that could happen when a community closes their news station. I think that the problems that Bethel and Kotzebue and Petersburg and Unalaska and all of these stations, that this is a service that people provide and they really help their communities. I don't want to say you can't put a price tag on that because apparently you can, but it's work that comes from a place of like community service. We live in these communities. We don't parachute in. And I used to feel negative about people who parachuted in and they don't really know the communities. They don't really know what they're talking about. And even when it happens in Anchorage, and like I'm somebody who I have no intention of leaving Anchorage. And so I am invested in what happens to the Anchorage School District. I'm invested in what happens with the Anchorage Assembly as a citizen, as a resident. When I lived in Kotzebue, I was invested in what the city did. And I think that if we don't find sources of funding to counterbalance the loss that they're facing, we're not going to get the fullest picture of Alaska that we can. And I think that we're going to see communities that just their concerns fall by the wayside because the media doesn't just inform Kotzebue, but it informs outside groups about what's happening in Kotzebue. I think that we see that with like when Ashley Johnson Barr was killed, right? That was a statewide story. And now granted, KOTZ didn't have a news department at the time when that first happened. I covered the aftermath of it when I lived there. But we are going to see less and less focus on our rural communities and not even just like the struggles, but like the joys of those communities. And I don't say this to disparage Channel 2, but if you read a story about Kotzebue in Channel 2 or any of the villages in that area, most rural villages in general, it's about like a murder, right? Because that is what Channel 2 sort of focuses on in their coverage, because it's easy to pull trooper dispatches from Anchorage about something that happens out in the community. That's absolutely news that should be covered. But if the only news that you're telling about a community are stories about people dying, that has an impact on how audiences view that community. It's why diversity in journalism matters so much, because if all of the stories you're writing are about one perspective, you as a journalist miss out on learning about other places, which I think is something I don't take for granted in my job, is that I really get to learn about my state and learn about my community in ways. I have an all access pass that not every citizen gets the privilege of having. But at the same time, we aren't going to find out the cool things that happen in our communities. And constantly, my heart is filled by these great stories that come out of our rural communities, just people living their lives and sharing joy, coming together in times of hardship, struggling when, they're facing these big issues, these existential issues, things like climate change, all of these things. Like, you're just missing a perspective, and that when that perspective's gone, it's hard to make it up. And then also, not to paint a broad picture of politicians, but when I moved to Kotzebue, I had to train a bunch of people to be used to somebody being in their business. I was at borough meetings and city meetings, and I was asking these questions about what was being done. And when you don't have somebody doing that, you're beholden to the goodwill of our elected officials. And you know as well as I do that not every politician has a level of goodwill. I don't know that most do. I don't know that I'm particularly, just personally, trustful of everybody who's in office, regardless of party. And when you're able to do things behind closed doors, the public doesn't benefit from that.
Wesley Early, thank you so much for being on the show today. Is there anything that I didn't ask you about that you were expecting to talk about? Anything that you wanted covered that I didn't cover?
I think that I would be remiss if I didn't tell your listeners that if they think public media is valuable, if they think that communities being able to celebrate themselves and really paint a picture, not taking into account all of the emergency broadcasting stuff, that's stuff that I don't even need to talk about why that's important. But consider donating to us, Alaska Public Media. Consider donating to a rural station. Consider donating to KNBA in Anchorage, who they cover a lot of stories that are focused on our native communities that we don't often get the chance to cover. But yeah, I think that would be my push, is that I think now more than ever, we're going to keep working until we can't. And if you think that work is valuable, we'd really appreciate your donation.
Do you have a book to recommend?
Oh, so I'm actually 2/3 of the way through the book, The Message by Ta-Nehisi Coates, which came out last year. It's a broad thesis on the power of writing and communicating and why it matters. And he uses 3 different trips to illustrate that. He talks about visiting Africa for the first time. He goes to Senegal. He talks about being contacted by a South Carolina teacher who works in a school district that's trying to ban one of his other books, Between the World and Me. And so his experience in talking about that. And then the part of the book that got the most attention when it came out is about his experiences in Gaza. That's the part I haven't read yet. But if it's as good as the first 2 parts, I'm getting ready to be blown away. I think he's a really great writer. And then if I could recommend a book I think everybody should read, I'm a big believer in Dr. Martin Luther King as a public intellectual. And I think that if you feel like you are being delivered a bastardized view of Martin Luther King's opinions through our education system and through the public, you're not wrong. And you should absolutely read Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, which was the last book he wrote in his lifetime. And it's about basically, now that the Civil Rights Act has passed, what more needs to be done. And I think if you read that book, you would totally understand why in the 1960s, Martin Luther King was considered this political radical and not the guy that we have a federal holiday after. So I could not recommend that book enough.
Wesley Early, thanks again for being on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@aklite.gov or call 907-269-0123.